In this video, you will learn about the Next.js. Next.js is a React framework for the production, so it gives you some extra features as compared to the React. Like it gives you the file-based routing technique where you can just create the files and it will be converted into the pages in the application, and then it gives you an ability to pre-render the data and then show it to the user, and it is better for the SEOs as well. And it gives you an ability to create the full stacks app in just single application inside the Next.js, where we can just create the APIs in the application as well. So in this video, you will learn all about the Next.js. So we will cover the file-based routing, and then we will cover the pre-rendering of the data with the static side generation, with the server-side generation, and with the incremental static generation as well. And then we will just create an API, and then we will create a project with that API as well. And everything will be stored inside the MongoDB database. So it is a project-focused course, so everything will be covered within the projects. So let's start. So please like the video and please subscribe to the channel as well, so I should be motivated to post the videos like this. So let's start the tutorial. Hello everyone, my name is Nikhil. So in this video, we will discuss about the Next.js file-based routing, that what it is, how it is different from the React routing, and why we need that if the React routing is already available. So let's start. So what is the file-based routing? So the Next.js has a file system-based router which is built on the concept of the pages. So when a file is added to the pages directory, so suppose you add a about page to your website, so you just need to add a about.js file and then you just write that component there. So you don't need to use that component anywhere inside that. So it is automatically be available as a route. So that is a file-based routing. So the files inside the pages directory can be used to define the most common patterns. So the file-based routing works with the files and not on the route paths as in the React.js, as we added the route, the element, and then we need to render that component there. And now no more path-based routing inside the Next.js. So the Next.js has changed the concept of the path-based routing. So here, although it was very good, but it can be a bit cumbersome. Like here you have the routes, then we add the route part equals to the blocks add my blocks. So it can be a bit cumbersome when you are building an enterprise level application. So there will be multiple routes that can look confusing in the end. So that's why the Next.js has introduced the file-based structure for the routes. But how can we do that? So we just need to create the files as we do in the most basic HTML, and we just need to write the React code there, and in the end the Next.js will detect that this file is available and then it will automatically register that to the route. So it is same as the HTML navigation system, in which we create pages for each route path. So now we will see an example. So here we have the pages and then we have the API, and the API folder is used to add the API for the backend inside the application. And then we have the books as we do in the HTML. We have the books, we have the index.js inside the books as the home page, and then we can have dynamic paths that we'll see later in this video, because now after this PPT we will learn about the file-based routing and then we will just create a project based on that, and then it is same like the HTML. So now we will see the demo of this application that we are building. So here now you can see now we have different books onto the website. So now you can see now we have the localhost 3000 and then we have the books, and then now we are into the index.js of the books. But once we will move on to the detail page, now you can see now we can just dynamically move on to the detail page inside that. Now you can see now we have the ID as well there. So the dynamic routing is also available, and then we can just detail any book from there, and then you can see the ID of the book inside the URL as well. So now these are the dynamic routing inside that. So we will just create this project in the end after discussing about the file-based routing inside the Next.js. So let's start. So please like the video and please subscribe to the channel as well, so I will be motivated to post the videos like this. So let's start building the application. And now I'm into the VS Code, and now we need to just create a new Next.js application in which we can demo the file-based routing. So for that we need to just create a new Next.js application. So the command to create the new Next.js app will be the npx. It will be the create-next-app, and then the name of the application which we want to create, like it can be my app. So then after that you need to just press enter, and the Next.js app will be then installed within very few moments. So just press enter, and now the app will be then installed within very few moments. And now the Next.js app is now installed, and now you can see we have the my app directory inside this file-based routing. And now you can see the first folder that we have is the next, which is of no use as of now. And now you can see then we have the node modules folder, which contains all of the packages which we need to use inside this Next.js app. And after that we have the pages folder, which is very important, which is available for the file-based routing. So in the pages folder, the first folder that we have is the API folder. So what does the API folder does? So the API folder, so the files inside this API folder works on the server side, and not on the client side. So in the API folder, we can just create the API for the application, which will be available to use throughout this whole application inside that. And then, as we all know that the Next.js app, we can have the backend and the front end same inside this single application. So we don't need to create another application for the backend or the front end. So the API folder is useful there. So inside this API folder, we create the API for the application, which we can call from the front end. And other than API, all of the folders are now exposed to the front end. So we have the index.js, and then we have the app.js, and the app.js is the root component of all of the component pages here. And then we have the index.js, and now you can see in the index.js, it is the home page of any HTML file which runs without adding any parameter to the URL. So it is the basic home page, and after that we can just create different files, and then we don't need to add any components here like in the React. Like in the React, we add the routes, and then we have the different routes like the path and the elements. So here we don't need to add any route or anything. So we just need to create here the file, and then we can just run that file onto that browser, like the /about/ it can be contact / it can be products. So this is how the Next.js routing works. And now we can see the folders like public. So in the public folder, first thing that we have is the favicon.io, which is now available for the tabs. Like you can see inside these tabs, this icon will be then available inside the browser tabs. And then we have the versal.svg, which has the svg icon of the versal. And then we have the styles, and the first style that we have is the globals.css, which will be available globally throughout this application. So we don't need to import that, but the styles will be then available globally to all of these files. And then we have the home CSS, which is like a home page of the application, and it is now exposed to the index.js. And then we don't need anything from there, so we can just remove that. And then we can just remove this home.module.css file as well. And then after that, we have the ESLint file, which just extends the capability and the quality of the code. And then we have the config files for the Next.js to run and build the Next.js applications. And then we have the package.json, contains the description of the application, like which dependencies we are using. Like we are using the next version of the 12, we are using the React 18 and the React DOM 18 as well. And then we have some more development dependencies as well. So this is the folder structure that we have discussed. And now let's again move into the pages folder that we have. So we have the API. So as we just discussed, that the API folder files runs on the server side and not on the client side. And other folders than the APIs, other than API, all of these folders are now available and exposed to the front end. Like we have the index.js, and then you can see we have some content inside the index.js. And then we can just remove everything from there because we need to start from the scratch. And after that, we can just add here the div, and the div can contain a hello world. So after that, everything is done. So we can just remove everything from the import statements as well. And after that, we can just start the development server as well. So to start the development server inside this Next.js app, so we need to run the command as the npm run dev. So it will just start a local development server into our machine. So we can just press enter. So I think we are not into the my app directory, so we can just move on to the my app. And after that, we can just add here the npm run dev. So this will start a development server on the localhost 3000. Like now you can see the application is now compiled and the server is now open. And now we can just open this localhost 3000. And now you can see now we have the hello world to the application. And now you can see, as compared to the React, the Next.js is very fast in compiling and in building the application. So we can just use the Next.js for our next applications. And after that, now you can see now we have the index.js file, which is serving the hello world. And after that, if we just need to create a new file, like it can be about us page. So in the standard React, we needed to just create a component like the about us, and then we need to just export that component. And then we needed to use this component inside the app.js or inside any parent component. But now in the Next.js, we don't need to do that. We need to just create a file, and it can be about.js. And inside this about.js, we can just create a function, like it can be a function as the about us. And after that, we can just return something from there, like it can be a return as the h1, like it can be about us. And after that, we can just create here the export statement, export default as the about us. And now we need to just save, and so we can just move on to the about us, like with the /about. So we can just move on to the application. Like now you can see the index.js is serving the hello world. And if we just move on to the about, So now you can see, now we have the about us page onto the applications. So this is as simple as this. So we just need to create a folder as the about.js, and then this folder will be then available inside the routes. And same like the HTML structures, as we learned the HTML, like how the routing works in the HTML, the same routing works inside the Next.js as well. And after that we can have the nested routes as well inside that. So for the nested routes, like now you can say we have the about us page. So for the about us page, as we have moved on to the about, so we can also create a folder as the about, and then we can just create a index.js page inside that. So I will not delete this from there, and if I will not just move on, and if I will not just create a folder, it would be the about, and inside the about, if I will not just create here the index.js, the home page of the about us page, and in the index.js now we can just create another function, like it can be a function, can be about us home page, and after that we can just create a component function, and inside that we can just return something, like we can return the jsx again, like it can be hello world, like it can be about us in the h1 tag, and after that we can just export this function as well, export default as the about us page. So if I will now just save, so everything would work same as before. So if I will now refresh the page, like now you can see the about us is still here, and then we can have some more nested routes as well inside that. So we can just create another, like it can be me, like it can be about me.js, and in the about me then we can just create another function, like it can be about me, and after that we can just export this as well, export default as the about me. So it would be the export, and inside this function, like we can just return the jsx again, like it can be about me, I am Nikhil Thadani. So this is the about me. So if I will now just save, and if I will now just move on to the application, refresh the application again, and then we have the about, and then if I will now just move on to the about/me, so now you can see, there's nothing on the web page, but now instead of this me, you need to add here the about me only. So it would be the about me, and if you will just rename this file to the from the about me to only the me, then it would work as the me only. Then you can see now we have the 404, and then we can just add here the me, and then this page would be then exposed to the front end. And then after the me, then we can just create another nested route as well, like inside this about, we can just create another folder, like it can be a team, and it can be a team, and after the team we can just create the index.js inside this team as well. So the index.js inside this team will work same as before. So we can just create a component function again, like it can be a function, and it can be a about team, and in the about team then we will have the function here, and then we will just return that this can be a h1 tag again, and in the h1 it can be about team, and in the about team then we will have the export statement, export default as the about team. So now if I will now just save, and if I will now just move on to the browser once again, and now you can see after the about, then we can just add here the team as well. So in the about/team, now you can see we have the about team, and then we can just create another folder, like it can be a member.js, and inside the member now we can just have another function, and it can be a member, and inside this member then we will have another return statement, and it can be again the h1, like it can be a members in the team, and after that we can just export this function as well, export default as the member. So if I will now just save, if I will now move on to the application once again, so if I will now just move on to the team/member, so now you will see there will be the members in the team. So this is how the nested routes work inside this Next.js. So now we have covered the functionality, and we have covered the deep understanding of the nested routes. So we can just clear, and then we can just delete this about us page as well. So now after that, now we will just move on to the dynamic routes. And now we have deleted the about us page, because now we will move on to the dynamic routes. So for the dynamic routes, we can just create another folder inside the pages, and it can be a books. So we will see an example of the books inside that. So in the books, now we will just have here one more thing, like it can be index.js, and then inside the index.js now we will have another function, like it can be a function as the book home, and inside that now we can just have here the function, and inside that we can just return the books as well from there, like it can be a books homepage, and inside this book homepage now we can just have here the export default, and it can be a book home. So now if I will now just save, if I will now move on to the application, like now we don't need the about, it will be the books. So if I will now just save, so now you can see now we have the home page of the books as the index.js. And after that, if we want to see the dynamic routes, so in the books folder for creating the dynamic routes, we need to add the square brackets .js, and inside the square brackets now we need to add the id or anything which we want to see the information about this book. So like if we can just have a id here, and then we can just save this, and inside this id we can just create another function, like it can be a book detail, and then we can just create a function like it can be a return h1, and it can be a book detail. And after that we can just export the default as the book detail. So now what it is doing, it will just create a dynamic route. So this route will work for any id of the book that we want. So this route will work for any parameter after this books. So now this route will be working whenever we will just move on to the books / anything, like we can have the id, we can have the name of the book. So by default we will have the id. So if I will now just save, and if I will now just move on to the application, now you can see now we have the books, and then we have the books homepage. But if we just move on, and if we just add any other parameter after this books, like we can have the id of the book, like we can have a b1. It's like if I will now just hit enter, and then you can see now we have the book detail page as well. And if we just move on to the b2 or b3 or any number of ids that are available inside the books, so this page will work on all of that dynamic ids. So this is how dynamic this page it is. So it will work on any number of ids inside this books, like we can have b3, we can have b4, we can have b100, and then all of these books will be then available. And for all of the ids, this page will be then available. So this page will handle all of these ids after the books. So this is how the dynamic routing works inside this Next.js. And now after the dynamic routes, now we will see an example of the slug routing. So what does that mean? So it means that you can have as many parameters in the URL as you want. Like if I show you an example, like you can see this is at the guardian.com website, and now you can see they have the filter onto the blocks page. Like you can see they have the category as the technology, then they have the year, then they have the March, then they have the 09 at the September, and then they have the blocks. So this is a very big URL. So for that you can also create some dynamic routes, but it would be complex. So for that the Next.js has a solution to create this slug inside this URL as well. So we can just close that now. And now for that we can just create a slug as well. So for creating the slug, we can just move on, and then we can just create another dynamic route, but it will be a slug file. So it can be a slug. So it can be a slug.js. So this will be the file name, and what this file name will do. So first we can just create a component, like it can be a slug. And after that we can just return something, like it can be a slug here, like we have the h1, and inside the h1 we have the slug page. And then we can just move on, and then we can just export as well with the export default, and it can be a slug. So if I will now just save, and if I will now move on to the application, so now you will see the slugs here. So now we have the books, and then we have the id of the book, and this page will be then run from this file. And after that we can just move on, and then we can just create another route inside that, like it can be a March, and then it can be a 09, and then it can be a year as the 2022, and then we can have the block as well. So now you can see this is very big route, but if you will just hit enter, so now you will see the slug page will be then open. So you can have as many number of parameters as you want inside the URL, and all of these parameter values. And if you have the big parameter values, then you can just move on to the slug page. Then you will automatically be moved on to the slug page inside that. So this is how the slug pages work. So you can have as many number of parameters as you want inside the URL, and then this slug page will be then working for all of the URLs. And now we have seen the examples of the static routes, the nested routes, the dynamic routes, and then we have also seen the multiple param routes. But now one thing is missing, like if you want to get the IDs of the parameters, so how we will do that in the Next.js. So now if I will now just move on to the id.js, which is the dynamic page, and then we need to just import something from the Next.js to get the value of that URL parameter as well. So like we need to just import something from the next, and it can be a router. So we need to import something from the next router, and it will be a use router. So we have the use router hook, and after that we can just move and we can just declare a variable, can be a router, and it will be equals to the use router hook. So now we have just declared a use router. So if you will just log what is inside the use router, so we can just log the router here. So if I will now just save, and if I will now just move on to the book slash the ID of the book like 1. So if I will now just move on to the inspect, move on to the console, like now you can see now we have some objects. If I will now just open the last object, and then you can see we have something inside this object. We have the path of the books as well, we have the routing path as well, like we have the books slash 1, and then we have all of the things, and then you have the path name as well, like you have the book slash ID, and then you have the push functions if you want to push to the routes, and then you have all of the things that you want. And the main thing that we have is the query. So the query object contains the ID which is available inside the URL. Now you can see now we have the ID as the 1, and if you will just have the ID as it can be anything like the 100. So now you can see now you will have the ID in the query as the 100, like now you can see we have the ID as the 100. So this is how we can get the values of the routes as well inside the routing, and then we can just move on to the Slug.js to get the value here as well. So we need to import again, so it would be import, and it can be the use router from, it can be the Next.js next their router, so it would be then imported, and now we can just declare router, and it will be equals to the use router hook. And if you will just log this value of the use router, and then if you will just move on to the slug routes, like you can say 100, like you can see the March, and then you can see the any number of value like the December and the year as well, 2021. So if I will now just save, so now you will see now we are in the slug page, and now you will see interesting thing in the query, like now you can see you have the array of the URL parameters in the query. Like now you can see the first is the 100, and then the second we have the March, and this third we have the 12, and then we have the fourth array which is the 2021. So this is how the slug parameters work, and it is very helpful if you are building a blog page website. So you have the blocks, you have the filter on the URL as well. So this is very helpful if you have the filters on the web page. So this is how the routing works, and this is how we can get the parameters of the routing inside the Next.js. So now we have covered the routings, we have covered static routes, we have covered nested routes, we have covered dynamic routes, we have covered multiple routes with the parameters, we have covered slug routes, and then we have also covered that how to get the values of the routes as well. So now we will see an example. So now we will just create an example project. It will be a mini project on the file-based routing, which we will create inside the Next.js. So now let's start building that project. So now we can just start building that project. So now you can see now we have almost the same application. We have the books, and then we have the ID page, and now I have removed the slug page from there because we don't need that. So we have the index.js, and then we have the dynamic id.js inside the books folder, and then we have nothing inside this home page as well in the index.js. So now we can just start building the data of that books. So now we can just create a folder inside the my app directory, and it can be a data, and then inside the data now we can just have a file, and it can be a utils.js, and then we can just create the data inside the utils. So we can just have a const, and it can be a books, and it will be equals to the array of the objects. So we can have the array of the objects. So we can have the ID, and the ID can be a 1, and then we can have the name of the book, and the name can be equals to the mindset, and then after that we can have description of the book as well, and the description can be this is my first book. And after that we can just copy this object multiple times. So we should have the 5 books onto the web page, so we can just copy this 4 times. So now we have the books. So now we can just change the ID. So this is the 2, and it can be the secret, and then we can just have the ID equals to the 3, and it can be the money, and then it can be the ID equals to the 4, and it can be atomic habits, and then we have the ID equals to the 5, and it can be the rich, dad, and a poor, dad. So now we have some books. So now we can just save, and then we can just use this books array into our books page. So now we can just move on to the books, and in the index.js now we need to import this books as well. So we can just import the books from the slash utils. So we can just import slash the utils slash we have the, I think we need to move on to the mod directory. So now we have the data slash utils. So now we need to just export that data as well from there. We need to add the export const as the books, and after that we can just move on again to the index.js, and now we need to add the books. So now we have imported the books, and now inside the return page, and now I will now just add here the div so it would be the div, and inside the div we will have the expression. So the expression will be data that we have, so it can be the books dot map. So now we will just map through all of the books, so it can be a book, and after that we can have the index of the each item of the book, and after that we can just declare a list of that. So we can just have here the div inside that, and inside that div we can have the key property, and the key property can be equals to the index, and after that we can just move on, and then we can just provide here the h1 tag. So we can have the h1, we can have the book dot name inside the h1, and after that we can just move on, and then we can just have a paragraph tag. So in the paragraph tag we will just have here the book dot, and it will be the description, and after that we will have here the link from the Next.js. So we can have the link. So for now it will be the article tag only. We can have article tag, and in the article tag then we will be having the link inside that. So now we will render the link later, but now we will just see all of the books onto that web page. So now we have just defined here the books.map, and then we will see every available book inside that. So now we can just define some style links as well. So now for now, if I will not just move on to the slash books, so now you will see there will be some books onto the web page. So now you can see you have the mindset, you have the description, you have the secret, you have the make money. Now you have all of the books onto that web page, and now you can just declare some styles as well. So you can just import the React as well from the React to add some styles inside that. So in the div now you will be having some styles, so you will have the style. So we will just add here the styles in the inline only, because we don't need to add inside the CSS. So we can just have here the width of that. So the width can be equals to the 300 for now, and after that we can have the background, and the background can be equals to the white smoke. So now we have just defined the styles with the background, and then we can just have here the margin, and it can be equals to the auto. And for the display I need the display as the flex, so we can have the display as the flex, and after that we can just have here the flex direction into the column, and after that now we will just have it justify to the content, and it can be into the center, because we want all of the items inside the center. We can just align the items as well inside the center. So if I will now just save, and if I will now just move on to the application, now you can see, and now we have just defined these styles. So now I know these styles are not looking good, but now the focus is on the routing. So this project is based on the routing and not on the styles. So now these styles will be okay. And now inside this link then we will have some styles on the article tag as well. So we can have a style, and this style will contain some border, and it can be a 1 pixels, it can be a solid, it can be a black, and after that we can just add any style, like we can add a padding. It can have a padding as the 12, and after that we can just have a background, and the background can be #CCC. So if I will now just save, and if I will now just move on to the application, now you can see, now you will have the mindset, and then you can have and then you can have this is my first book, and then you can have the link, and then you can have the secret, you can have the make money, you can have the atomic habits, you can have rich dad poor dad. So now you have all of the books onto that web page. And now what you can do, you can just add here the link to move on to the ID page from there. So now from there, if you will just click any of the links, so we can just move on to the dynamic page, which is the ID. So for that we can just add here the link from the Next.js. So we need to import the link. So it can be import something from the Next.js, and it can be from the next/link. So we need to import the link. So I think the link is by default export, so we can just add here the link. So now we have imported the link, and inside that, instead of this link, so we can just use here the link only, and inside that link you can just have a ref prop for that. So you can have a ref, and in the ref you can just move on dynamically. So you can just have here the /books/ you will be having the ID of the books. So you will have the book that you have .id of the book. So now this is how you can just move on, and inside that you can just move on to the detail. You can just write here the detail. So if I will now just save, if I will now move on to the application, now you can see, now you have detail on all of the books inside that. So if you will just click the detail of the my first book, now you can see you are into the book detail, and the ID is equals to the 1. And if I will now just go back, if I will now move on to the secret, click on the detail, now you have again the book detail component, the ID equals to the 2, and same for every other route, and same for the every other books. So you can have the detail for the rich dad poor dad, the ID will be equals to the 5. So this is how we have just created the application. So this is how we can just create the dynamic routes inside this web page. And now we can just move on to the ID page, and then we can render something for the ID. So we can just have a functionality that we can just get the book from that ID in the URL. Like if I will now move on to the book/1, so we can just get the book from that ID. So for that, we can just move on to the utils, and then we can just declare a new function here as the export. It will be the const, it will be the fetch book from the ID. So we can just have here the function, and this function will contain something in the arguments. So it will contain the ID as the parameter. So after that, we will just return the books. So we can just have a const fetched book will be equals to, we have the array of the books. So we have the books dot, it would be the find method. So the find method will find a book from the database on a given condition. Like we can have a book as the parameter. So we can just have the condition like book dot ID will be equals to the ID that we have received in the parameter. So now we have just defined that, and after we will fetch the books. So we can just have here the return, and it can be a fetched book. So now we have just returned that. So now we can just move on again to the dynamic page, which is the index.js, and here we can just import that function as well from there. So we can just import that from, I think is available inside this data slash, it can be in the utils, and inside that we can just import that function as well. So it will be the fetch book from ID. So now we have imported that fetch book from ID function, and now we need to get this URL parameter as well for the ID. So for that, as we have discussed in the tutorial video, so we can just have the import, and we need to import the use router from the, it will be the next/router. So now we have imported the use router, and now we need to get the parameter ID as well. So we can have a const, and it will be equals to the query, and it will be equals to the use router. So now we are extracting the query from the use router. So now we can just have here the ID as well. So we can have a const book ID will be equals to the query dot the ID of the book. So now you need to make sure that this ID and this ID should be same. So if you are adding a book ID there, so you need to add the book ID. So the query will return the book ID. So now whatever name you will give to there, so it will be available inside that object. So now I've given only the ID, so it will be available as the ID. So now we have got the ID as well. So now we can just call that function as well to get the book from the ID. So we can have a const, it would be the book, and it will be equals to the fetch book from ID. So we can just have here the ID inside that. So for the ID, we can just provide the book ID. So now we will get the book from there. So with that, now we will get the book from there. So now we have to render the book as well. So we can just move on again to the index.js that we have just created. So we can just copy the div style from there. So we can just copy that inside div. So we can just copy, and then we can just move on to the id.js, and then we can just paste instead of the h1. So now we have just given that. So now we need to import the react from the react as well. So do the react from the react, and after that you need to remove the article tag, because now we don't need the ID, because now we don't need the link. So now we have the book.name, we have the book.description, and now you have everything of the book as well. So now what we are doing inside the book detail function, so we have the const query, and we have the router here, and then you can have the book ID, you can have the query.id, and then you can have the book as well from the fetched book from that ID. So it will get you the book from there, and after that you are now rendering the book. So if I will now just save, if I will now move on to the application, so now you will see an error. So now if I will now just refresh the page, I think now you can see the name is undefined, and now you can see the book is also undefined. So if you will just log the value of the book as well, for book, so now you will see the book is also undefined. So if you will just inspect, if you will just move on to the console, you can refresh the page. Like now you can see the book will be undefined, and now you can see uncaught error as well from the book. And it is happening because we also have the React as well inside this application, because the Next.js work on the top of the React. So for that, the functionality is same as per the React. So for that, we can just have here the condition as well. So we can have the condition like if we don't have the book, so then we will just return the paragraph tag only. So it can be a loading. So whenever the rendering will be done, so whenever the first render is done, so we will just have here the condition like when we don't have the book, we need to just return the paragraph tag as the loading, and when we will having the book, so we will just return this div. So if I will now just move on to the application, we can just refresh. I think the index is not defined. I think we don't need that index as well from there. So we don't need that key. And now if I will now just save, if I will now move on to the application, now you can see now we are getting the book, and now you are getting the book inside the inspect as well. If you will just move on to the console, you are getting the book as well from there. Like you can see, there's a description. This is my first book. You have the ID of that book, you have the name of that book, and everything of that which are available inside the data. So you can just fetch anything from the database as well from there, and after that you can have all of the books from there. So if you will just detail the secret as well, now you can see you have the secret onto the web page. If you will just have here the detail of the atomic habits, so you can just have the detail as well, and after that everything is working perfectly fine. So now we have just completed the project of the dynamic routing inside the Next.js. And in this project, you have learned about the dynamic routing and how we can just move on to the different routes, and how to use the router variables inside the next router, and how to move on to the different route with the link inside the router. So now we have just completed this application. And the styles of this completed application is not good, I know, because we are just only focusing on the routing page, that how to work on the dynamic routes and not on the styling. Now we have covered the mini project with the file-based routing inside the Next.js. So now let's see the summary of what we have built. So we have just learned about the static routes, we have learned about the nested routes, and we have learned about the dynamic routes, and we have also learned about the slug routes. So now we have learned everything about the file-based routing, and then we have also created the project as the bookstore application with the routing. So now we have covered the file-based routing inside this video. So that's all for this video. So thank you for watching the video, and I hope you will like the video as well, and please subscribe to the channel as well, so I will be motivated to post the videos like this every time. So thank you. Hello everyone, my name is Nikhil. So in this module we will learn about the pages pre-rendering inside the Next.js, and we will have a look on the static site generation, the incremental static generation, and the server-side rendering. So now what is the pages pre-rendering? So inside the Next.js, the pages on the website is first generated and then shown to the user. But what does that mean? So the data is fetched from the server once and then sent back to the component, and then only the component function runs. So this is the cycle of the pre-rendering, and unlike React, the data is also available inside the HTML file inside the page source. That makes a big advantage over the React application, because the content is also available in the initial render, and it is best for the SEOs, and it is best choice for the SEOs because you have the data in the HTML source, and in the React there is no any data in the HTML source, and all we can see is the div ID equals to the root, and the content is dynamically updated on time. So in the Next.js, we don't see any loading state or any loading spinner while rendering the page, and the SEOs are very good with the pre-rendering. So this make a big advantage for the Next.js over the React. Now we will see the forms of the pre-rendering. So the first is the getStaticProps, which means that we need to statically generate the pages, and it is also known as the static site generation that we know. So we statically generate the pages and pre-render the content onto that web page, and then we don't see any loading spinner or any other state as well. So it is the most used and the best approach only if you know about the pages in your application. So you should know about the pages in your application, that no, because it serves the possible instances of a page. Like some pages are frequently visited, so you know that this page would be frequently visited, so you can just statically generate that page, like for the home page, like for the about us page, the contact us page, and for like featured products on the website. Those pages are frequently visited, so you can just pre-render that pages with the getStaticProps. And then if you have some static data to show on the website, which is only required to fetch from the server once or not frequently, then you can use this getStaticProps, and it is the best approach. So now we will dive deeper into it by just creating a new Next.js application directly from the scratch, and then after we will move on to the second form of the pre-rendering once we need it. So now we will dive deeper into these getStaticProps, and then we will have a look on the incremental static generation as well with the getStaticProps. So now let's dive into it. And now I'm into the VSCode, and now we need to just create a new Next.js application directly from the scratch. So the command to create the Next.js application would be the npx. It would be the create-next-app, and then after that we need to enter the name of the application which we need to install. So it can be the my app. So after then, if you will press enter, so the Next.js app will be then installed within very few moments. And now you can see the Next.js app is now installed, and now we can just move on to the directory. And now you can see now we have the pre-generation folder, and inside that we have the my app, which is just installed. And now you can see now we have the next folder, which is used for building the Next.js applications. And then you can see now we have the node modules folder, which is used for the packages. And then now you can see we have the pages directory, which is used for the routing. And then we have the public directory, and after then we have the styles directory. And now we need to just move on to the index.js inside the pages, and after that we need to remove the content inside this div because we don't need them at all. So I will now remove this, and now we need to remove the class name as well from there. And now we need to just remove the styles import as well. And after that we need to just delete the home.module.css as well because we don't need them at all. And then we have the index.js, and after that we can just render here the hello. And now we can just start the development server on our machine. So for that we need to just move on to the directory into the my app, and then npm run dev to compile and to run the application. So after this command, there will be a local development server which will be running at the port of the 3000 in our machine. So let's hit enter. So now you can see the server is started and ready into the localhost at the rate 3000. And after that we can just move on to the localhost 3000. And now you can see the localhost 3000 is open, and now you can see now we have the hello inside the web page. So everything is working perfectly fine. So now we have just created a fresh Next.js application, and now the first thing which we need for the static generation to add the data. So we need to add the data into a server. So we can just get the data from any server, but the preferable choice would be add the data to the Firebase. So we can just move on to the Firebase, and then we can just add the data to it. So for that we can just create a JSON file here for now, and it will be the temporary file. And after creating the JSON file, then we will import the JSON file inside the Firebase. So for that, inside the public, I will just add here the JSON file. It will be the dummy.json. And after that, now we need to add some data here, like we can add a project name as the bookstore. So we can just have a JSON data here, and it can be a books, and it will be an array of the books. And after that we will have multiple objects inside the array of the books. Like we can have the object, and it will have the name property of the book, and the name can be the mindset. And after that we can have a description of the book, and after that the description would be can be the mindset book. And after that now we can just have the ID of the book as well. So the ID can be equals to the 1. And now we have this object, and now we can just copy this, and now we can just paste it few more times. And after that we have 3, 4, 5. So now we have 5 books inside the database. So now we can see, now we can add some commas here as well. And after that we can just change the name, like it can be the Atomic Habits, and the description can be the Atomic Habits book. And after that the ID would be the 2. And then same for the third ID. So it can be the Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and the ID of the book will be the 3. And then we need to change the description as well, and it can be a Rich Dad book. And then after that we can just change the fourth ID as well. So it would be the ID equals to the 4, and this would be the ID equals to the 5. And after that we can just change the name as well, like it can be a Make Money, and the description can be the Make Money book. And after that we can have a last book, like it can be a Love, and after that it will be the Love book. So now we have just created a books array of the JSON data, and then we can just move on to the reveal in Explorer. And after that we can just move on to the Firebase. So we can just search for the Firebase here. So to the Firebase, and after that you will see there will be a link of the Firebase. And now you can see we have the Firebase, and the Firebase is like a no code backend which you can use because it doesn't need any code. And this is a fully flexible backend which you can use without writing a single line of code. So you can just use Firebase for the data, and then after that you can just move on to the go to console, and then you can just create a new Firebase project from there. You can just click on the add project, and then you can just start the name of the project as well, like it can be a Next.js. And then after that you can just confirm, and then you can just click on the continue. And after that you can just turn off the Google Analytics as well because we don't need them at all. And now we can just move on, and then we can just click on the create project button. So it will just create a Firebase project for us. So we have to wait till it just create a new Firebase project for us. and the Firebase project is now ready, and then we can just click on the continue, and then the project will be open, and now we can just move on to the real-time database inside that. So we can just click on the real-time database, and then there will be the option to create the database. So we have the button, and then we can just click on the create database button, and then you can just have a default settings, and then you can just click on the next, and then you can see now we have two options: the start in the locked mode and start in the test mode. So now in the locked mode, the read and write would be the false, and now we can just move on, and then we can just click on the start in test mode because we need to test the application. After that, you can just click on the enable button, and now this will be the URL of the API which we need to call, and then after that we can just click on the three dots here, and then we have the option of the import the JSON file. So we can just click, and then we can just import the JSON file that we have just created. So now we have just opened this, so we can just move on the dummy API.json into the Firebase. So now we can just drag the file here, so now you can see now we have the dummy.json file, and then we can just click on the import, and after that the data would be then imported within a few seconds. So now you can see the data is now imported, and then we have the books data here, and then we have some array of the data inside that. We have the array of the objects of the data inside that. So we have the 0 field, which we have the description of the mindset book, and then we have the id equals to the 1, and then we have the description which has the atomic habits book, and then we have the id equals to the 2, and then we have the description 3, description 4, and then the description 5. So now we have just created the data, and now we can just move on to the application, and now we need to just build the routing here. So for the routing, we need to move on to the pages folder, and now we need to just remove the dummy JSON file here as well. So now we need to move on to the pages directory, and then we have the index.js file, and now we don't need anything inside the index.js, so I will leave it empty. And now we can just move on and declare a new folder inside the pages. It can be the books, and after the books I will now just create a new file. It will be the index.js, and after that I will now create a new file as well for the dynamic id of the page. It will be the id.js. And if you don't know about these dynamic IDs, dynamic routing inside the Next.js, so I have a video recorded for that. So I will put the link inside the description, so you can just check that out. And after that we can just move on to the index.js, and then we can just add here the function. So it will the function, it would be the book home, and then we can just have the function, and then we can just return something inside the function as well, like it will be the books. And after that we can just move on, and then we can just export default this function as well as the book home. So now we can just save, and then we can just move on to the localhost 3000 again, and after that you can just move on to /books, and then you will see there will be a books there. So now we can see now we have the books. So now we have just created the folder structure of the routes as well. So now we need to add the content for the pre-generation of the data. So for the static site generation, it means that we can first statically get the data from the server, and then load the page, and then show it to the user. So it's very good approach given by the Next.js, because it will have to even fetch the server side code before the component runs. So we don't see any loading state or a loading spinner or the loading text of the data. And the big advantage is that the content is also served inside the page source, which is best for the SEOs, which was missing in the React applications. So let's start. So as we have discussed inside the PPT, so we have a function called the getStaticProps, which will run the code on the server side and not on the client side. So it generates and returns the props for the component that we want to use. It is as simple, and it only runs on the server side, so you can say inside the node environment and not on the browser. So for that we need to just create this function. It would be the export, it would be the asynchronous function, so it will be the async function, and it will be the getStaticProps. So now we have just created this function, and after that we need to just run the server side code here. So for that, either we can just fetch the API here as well. So we can just fetch the API data from there, from the Firebase here only. So for that we can just move on, and then we can just have here the good folder structure for that. So we can just move on, and then we can just generate a new folder. So it can be my app, and then we can just have here the folder can be a utils, and after that you can, in the utils we can have the folder as the API-utils.js file. And now inside this file we will now have a function to fetch the data. So it will be the export, it will be the async function again, and it will be the get books. And then this would be the asynchronous functions. So we will add a promise handling here as well. So now we will fetch the data here in this function, and then we will use that data inside the index.js. So it will be a very simple approach. So we can just get the data as the const, it will be the books, and it will equals to the fetch function from the JavaScript, which is available inside the JavaScript only. So we can use the XCOs as well, but now the fetch is already available in the JavaScript, so we can just use the fetch as well. And now we can just get the URL of this data. So we can just copy this URL from here, firebase.com, and after that we can just paste the URL here, and after that we have the URL, and now you can see we have the slash here, and after the slash we need to add the JSON here as well. So now we have the books file, now we have the books, so the name of the data would be the books.json. So it is Firebase specific, so we can just have a books.json, and after that we can just close this line. And in the fetch, because it is an asynchronous task, so we can just await for the data as well. And after that it would not be the books, it will be the response. And after that we can just get the data from the response as well. So it will be the data, and it can be the await again. So we need to just convert the data to the JSON as well. So it will convert the response to the JSON. So now we got the data inside this data variable, and after that we can just return the data as well from there. And now we can just move on, and then we can just go to the index.js, and inside that we can just have here the data. And now we can just use that function here in the getStaticProps. So for that we can just have here the const, it will be the books, and it will be equals to that the function that we have just created, it will be the get books. So it will be the get books, and because it is also an asynchronous function and it is also a promise, so we can just add a await here as well. So now we have just created this function as the await get books. So now we got the books inside this books. So now we have got the books, and now how can we return some data which will just available inside this book home component as well? So we can just have here the return statement, and inside the return statement we need to return an object, and this will always be an object. So make sure you are sending the object inside this return, and inside this object you need to add the props key. So it is the Next.js specific, so you need to add the props, and after the props there will always be object, and inside the object you can just send any data. Like I can send the name, and the name can be equals to the Nikhil. So if I will now save, and if I will now just get the props here, so we can just destructure the props here only. So we got the name, and it can be the name only. So if I will now save, and if I will now just move on to the books here, so if I will now refresh the page, so now you can see now you got the name as the Nikhil. So we can just send any data from the props here. So now what this function is doing, it is just creating a async function as the getStaticProps, and it is running before the component function, and it is just getting the data from the server or any API, and it is running into the server side only, in the Node.js only, and not onto the browser. So this is how this function is executing. And after that, when we got the books, we can just send the books here. So we can just have a key of the books, and then the value can be the books as well. So now we are sending the data as the books object here, and now we can just move on to the name, and then we can just have here the books here. And after that we need to render all of the books here, so we can just remove this h1, and then we can just have here only the div, and inside that div now we will add the books. So we can just have an ordered list. So we can just have a UL, and inside that we will have an curly braces which in an expression, and now we will just map through all of the books. So we can just have here the books.map, and then we can just add here the variable also. So we can just have a book, and now we need to return something. So we need to just return here the li for the list item, and after that we can just have here the list item, and inside that list item we will have a div again because we have a lot of data. So we can just have here the h1 tag of the name of the book. So we can just have here the book dot name, and after that we have the description as well. So we can just have here the book dot description, and after that we will have the, so the description would be in the paragraph tag and not in the h1 tag. And after the description, now we need to add the link here. So for the link, we need to just click on the link, and then we need to just move on to the different route, and it would be the ID. So for that we can just add here the link. So after the paragraph we can just have here the article tag, and inside the article tag then we will have the link from the Next.js. So we will just import the link from the Next.js after that. So after the get books, so we can just import the link, it would the import, it would the link, and we need to import it from the next/link. So we have the package of the links. So now the link is now imported, and now inside this link, now we need to add the ref prop as well. So in the ref, now we need to move on to the ID of the book as well. So for that, we can just have here the ID. So we can just have a book.id. So now this will be open inside the /books/the ID of the book, and inside this link, we can just add here some text, like we can just have a go to book, and after that we can just save. And if I will now just save, and if I will now just move on to the browser, if I will now refresh the page, now you will see, now we got all of the books inside this web page. And now you can see this is very simple. So we are just creating the getStaticProps, and then we are fetching the data from these books, and then we are just returning the props with the books, and then this function is giving the props to the book home, and then this book home is using these props to make this possible. This is just, we have created the books onto the web page. And now if you will click on the page source, if you will just move on to the source page, click on the view page source, and now you can see, you can just click on the line wrap. Now you can see you got all of the books and all of their description as well inside this page source as well. So now this is very good for the SEO if you have the content, like if you have some content and if you want that content to be available inside the search engines as well. So this is very good approach for that, because in the React tab you don't see anything like this. You just see a HTML, and then you just see the div id equals to the root, and after the root you just dynamically add the content inside that root only. So now this is the very big advantage of the Next.js, which is the static site generation. So the site is statically generated, and you can see the content is also available for the Google search engine as well, which is very good for the profitable websites. So this is how we have just created. Now we have seen the getStaticProps, so we can see the summary and we can see the workflow as well of the getStaticProps. So when does this function executes? So the getStaticProps runs during the build time, and it generates the pages that we want to pre-render, and then we can just open any page from where the content is served. And it is known as the static site generation. You can see the SSG, where the content is statically loaded during the build process and not during the runtime. So we can't send the request from this function during the runtime or after it is deployed to a server. So now you can see, now we have just created the getStaticProps. And now we are able to fetch all of the books, and we are able to pre-render all of the books inside the web page as well. And now you can see, now we have the link as well for the go to books. So we can just move on to the ID page, and then we can just generate a component function here as well, like it can be the book detail. So now we can just work on this component, and inside that we can just return something, like it can be a paragraph tag again, it can be a book detail, and after that we can just export this function as well, export default, and it will the book detail. So if I will now just save, and if I will now just move on to the browser, if I will now just click on the go to book, and now you can see we have a 404 page. But why? I think we have done some mistakes. So we can just move on to the index books, and now you can see inside this link it will not be like this. So we need to add it inside the strings, and then it would be inside the expressions as well. So it would be dynamic, and after that we need to add the slash as well, books and slash this ID. So we can just save again, and then we can just move on to the browser once again. So we can just refresh, and now you can see, now we have all of the books. And once I will click on the go to book, and now you can see, now we are getting into the book detail page. So now everything is working perfectly fine. So this book detail page is working for every route after the book/ID. So it's a dynamic route. So now we can just fetch the book from this ID as well, and then we can just show the data inside this page as well for every book. So for that we can again move on to the getStaticProps. So we can just export the function again as the getStaticProps, to the getStaticProps, and after that we need to just fetch the data from this ID. So for that again we need to move on to the API utils file. So as we are getting all of the books from this function, so we can just create another function, and then we need to export this function as well. So it will the export async, and it will the function of the get book from ID. And inside this function we will just receive a parameter as the ID. So we will just fetch the book from this ID. So as we are getting all of the books inside this get books, so we can just get all of the books from these books here. So it will be the books, and it will be equals to the await, and then we need to get all of the books from there. So it will the get books from there. And now in this books, now we got all of the books that are available inside the database, and then we need to just find the book which matches this ID. So for that we need to just create a variable as const. It can be the fetched book, and it will be equals to the books that we are receiving, and it is an array. So we can just use the find method from the array to find the book from there. So we have the array.find, which will find the book from the given condition, and then we can have a condition in the callback, and we can just caveat the book, and after that we can just fetch the condition. So the book dot id should be equals to the id that we are receiving inside the parameter. So now we are just finding the book. So we are finding the book which has the id, the book.id equals to this id that we are giving here. So now we have the fetched book, and now we can just return the fetched book from here as well. So it will the return as the fetched book, and now we can just move on to the id, and after that we can just move on, and then we can just call this function. So we can just have a const book would be equals to the fetch book from id. So we can have a get book from id, and then we need to pass the id. So where can we get this id? So that's a big question, and we need to get deeper that how can we fix that problem. So how can we get this idea? Because we all know that the getStaticProps runs before the component function runs, so we cannot use the use router hook from there to get the id of the parameter, because it runs before the component function runs, and it runs on the Node.js and not on the client side. So we can just get the id, so even the use router won't work. So how can we do that? So by default inside the getStaticProps we get the context object inside that. So we get the context, and inside this context you have all of the features of this function, like from where you're calling this function, and all of the features, even the URL parameters as well. So for that we can just destructure a property from there. It will be the params. So we get the params property from there, and then we will just have the params dot id field which we are getting inside this getStaticProps. So this is the solution for it. So we get the book, and then we just fetch the book from this id, and then we have the params object, same as in the use router, but it runs on the server side. So we get the params, and then we have the params.id inside the get book from id. Now we need to just return this book from here. So we need to just return the props, and inside this props now we need to just return the book would be equals to the book. So we can just use the ES6 destructuring as well. So we can just remove this book colon book, and then we can just render the book as well. So now after this, now we can just destructure the book from here as well in the prop. So we can just have here the book, and then after that we can just have here again the div, and inside this div we will have the h1 tag. It would be the book dot name, and after that we'll have the paragraph. It would be the book dot, it will be the description, and after that it would also be the paragraph. And now we are getting all of the details. So now we have declared the getStaticProps, and then we are fetching the book from the id, and then we are returning that book, and then we are using that book inside the book detail props, and then we are rendering the data. So if I will now save, and if I will now move on to the application, now you will see there is an error. But what is this error? So the error is saying that the getStaticPaths is required for the dynamic SSG pages, which is the static site generation pages, and is missing for the book/id. So we have the book/id page here. So what does that mean? So the Next.js doesn't know that how many instances of this page, of this book, or you can say of these IDs, this file handles. So how many instances in the IDs this file handles? This can be 4, this can be 5, this can be 100, this can be thousands. So it doesn't know that how many instances this page file will handle, and it means that statically it doesn't know that what ID it will get inside this params object. So it also doesn't know that what ID will it get inside the params object, because it is not running on the client side. It is running on the node environment in the server side. So we need to tell Next.js that for these IDs you need to pre-render and pre-generate the content of this page. Like for specific IDs you can pre-render the pages. So we have the getStaticPaths function which is written there, which is required, which gives Next.js the paths for which it can statically generate the pages. But how does that work? So we just declare a function, and it can be export, it can be a function, and it will be like getStaticPaths. So this is the function, and after that we need to tell Next.js that for this instances, for what instances we return there. So we will return here the IDs like this. So we will just return here some IDs, and then the IDs will go to the getStaticProps, and then it will receive inside the params object. So it will fetch the ID from the params.id, and for those instances only it will pre-generate the page. So this is the relation. So now we can just send here some IDs, like we have the return statement, and inside this return statement we will just have the paths. So we need to send here the paths for the URL, and it will be an array of the objects. So it can be an array, and then we can have the object. So we can have the params property, as we are sending the params here, and then we are receiving here. So we need to send the params, and this will be an object. So we will be an object, and then we'll pass the ID field to the params as well, as we are receiving there. And make sure the ID here and the here should be the same, because now we are giving the ID, so it should be same. And after that we need to give the ID, and the ID can be a simple string. For now, if I will now give the ID equals to the 1, and after that I think we need to just add the fallback as well, and we will get to the fallback later. I will now just give the fallback equals to the false, and we will get to the fallback later. So if I will now save, so now what it is doing, so the getStaticPaths is now returning some static paths on the URL, which is the params equals to the ID1 after the book. And after that this params object will go to this params, and then it will grab the ID from this, and then the ID equals to the 1. So it will just fetch the ID where the book ID equals to the 1, and it will just pre-generate and pre-render that book page into this id.js page file. So this is how that works. So if I will now save, if I will now just refresh the page, I think the serializing the dot book return from the getStaticProps, I think there is an error. Please only return the JSON. I think there is an error. So the error can be, we can just see what it is. So we are sending the getStaticPaths, we are sending the static paths to the URL, and the fallback is equals to the false, and then we are just fetching the book from this ID. This is, so this should be await, because this is an asynchronous function, and this returns a promise. So if I will now save, so now if I will now refresh the, now you can see without refreshing the page, and anyways, so now we got the detail of the book as well. So now what it is doing, so now it is doing that for this instance of this page only, it will just statically generate the page. Like for this ID only, it will just statically generate the page. But if we move on to the other page, like if we move on to the localhost 3000 / if I will not just move to the ID2, then it will not generate the page. Now you can see now the 4 of 4 is true, because now the page for this ID is not pre-generated, or pre-rendered during the build process. So this is how the Next.js is working. So now we need to send all of these IDs to this getStaticPaths. So for that we can just get all of the books again. So we can just get all of the books, or it can be a books, and it will be equals to the await again. So it will the get books from there, from the API utils file. And after that we need to just create here a structure of the array where the params will be equals to all of the IDs that are available here. So for that again we can just do const, and it can be a paths object again, and it will be equals to the books dot map. So the map returns an array, so we'll use map, and then the book will be the callback parameter. And after that we will just declare a structure, like after the book we will now return an array. So for the return we need to add here the rounded brackets, and after that we need to return an object inside that, and object will contain a params, and the params will contain an ID inside that object only. So after the params also we need to add here the object, and the object will contain the field as the ID, and the ID should be equal to the book dot ID. So this is the structure that we have just created. So we have just created the paths array, and then we have just mapped the books, and then the mapping returns an array to the paths, and then we are just giving the structure of this, like we have the params ID equals to this, and the params ID equals to the book.id. So now we can just move on, and then we can just remove this, and then we can just have here the paths only to the getStaticPaths. So if I will now save, if I will now refresh the page again, I hope it works. So please pray to the God. So now we can just refresh the page, and after that if I will now go to the first book mindset, if I will now click on this URL, now you can see the mindset book is open. And if I will now go back, and if I will now just click on the second book, go to book, I think this should also works. So now if I will now click that, So now you can see the Atomic Habits is also working. And if I will now just click on any of the book, like if I will now click on the Love book, click on that, and then you will see this page will be then opened within very few moments here. So now you will see the Love book is now opened. So this is how the getStaticPaths and the getStaticProps relate. It will just send the params object inside the ID, and then the ID inside the params, and then it will get the IDs, and then it will generate the pages for these IDs only that we return here inside the parent books. So we are now giving around 5 IDs here. So it will just only generate the page for the 5 IDs. So this is how the getStaticProps and the getStaticPaths is working. So now we have just completed the application with that, with the getStaticProps. And now comes to a topic with the incremental static generation. So what does that mean? So now we have just created the application with the getStaticProps and the getStaticPaths. So now if I will now just build this application, so we can now stop this server, and then we can just have here the npm run and build. So we can just click, and then it should build the application for us. And now you can see now the build is created, and now you can see the SSG is there. And for the SSG, we have the filled dot with that. And then you can see for the books and the books page and the book/id page, we have the static generation of the websites. So this is how it works. So we add the static sites into the web page, but there is a problem. But what is the problem? Because the getStaticProps only works during the build time and not after that. So if I will now just move on to the application, and if I will now just start the application for the build, now we need to run the command as the npm start to start the build version. So we can just hit enter to start the production version, and then it will be started onto the localhost 3000 again. So we can just refresh the page again. And now you can see now all of the books are there, and now all of the books have the pre-generated pages of their IDs. So if I will now click on the go to book, and now you can see it is very fast now. And now you can see if I will now just go to book this, now you can see the rich dad poor dad, and now everything is working perfectly fine. But what is the problem then? So if I will now just move on to the Firebase again, the Firebase into the console of the Firebase into the real time. And now the thing is that if I will now just add one more object inside this books object, like if I will now just add one more object inside the books, and after that we needed to create the modification as well, because we have given the structure of the array, but the Firebase has the by default structure of the object. So we need to just create some object here as well after that. So we can just create a one more field, and the key can be equals to the 5, and the value will be equals to an object. So we can just give an value. So we can just give the JSON data again. So we can give the name, and the name can be equals to again the new book, and after that we can give the description, and the description again can be the again new book, and after that we need to provide the ID, and the ID can be equals to, so how many IDs we have given? We have given 5 IDs, so the ID will be equals to the 6 in this object. So the ID equals to the 6. So if I will now just click on the add, and now I have just created a new book for there as the 6th book, as the new book. And if I will now just move on to the localhost 3000/books, if I will now refresh the page, so now you will see nothing will happen, because the site is already generated and we cannot add any book after that. So it is good if you have the static content inside your website, but if you are just adding new request after that to the server, then the static site generation alone will not work. So we need to add the incremental static generation after that, which will just send the request to the database after a number of seconds. Like we can have the 60 seconds, we can have 120 seconds, even we can have after a day. So if you have a website like that, like the content will update after a day only, so you can just have the static site generation with the getStaticProps, but with the incremental static generation. So you can just add a key as the revalidate inside that. So in the index.js, I think you have the getStaticProps, and after that you need to just get something there. So now after this props, you need to add the revalidate here, and the revalidate key would be used, and after the revalidate you can give the revalidate equals to the 10 seconds. So what does that mean? So now next time when we build this application, so after every 10 seconds after the application has deployed, so after every 10 seconds it will send the request to the database to get all of the books. So this is the incremental static generation that we can use here, and after that we can just restart the application and we can just rebuild that. So we can run npm run build, And now you can see the build is now created, and now you can see there is one more option as the ISR, which is the incremental static generation, in which we uses the revalidate key, which will just send the request after the number of seconds that we pass here. And after that, you can see now we have the ISR inside this books page as well. So if I will now just start the build again, npm start, so it will start the production build. And then if I will now just refresh the page, and now you can see the new book is there as well. So everything is working perfectly fine. And if I will now just move on to the Firebase again, and if I will now just add one more book here, so it will be the key can be equals to the 6, and the value we can add another object here. So we can just click the drop down, select a new object, and it can be the name field, and the name can be a test again. And then we can send the description, and the description can be again, it should be inside the commas. And then after that we can add description like test description, and after that we can just have here the ID, and the ID would be equals to the 6 now. So if I will now save, and if I will now just click on the add, so now the Firebase will add new product inside that. So now after 10 seconds it will just send a new request to the database. So we have to wait till 10 seconds, and then we will just refresh the page. And now you can see, now I have tried after 10 seconds, and now you can see now we have one more book inside the application, which is test again. And then you can see now we have the test description, and then we have the go to book option as well. So now everything is working perfectly fine. And now we have just made the use of the static site generation, that how does that work, and how will it handles the static routes and the static paths and the static file generations. And then we have just created the incremental static generation as well. So it will just send the request after every 10 seconds to the server, because we have given the revalidate to 10, and then it will just grab all of the latest data from there. So now we have completed this static site generation. But one thing is missing about this fallback prop that we have just used inside the ID. So what does that fallback means? So in the fallback, if we give the fallback equals to the false, so it is saying to the getStaticPaths that if we have new paths, like if we don't have that paths inside that, so we need to return the 404 page. So if there is a false, and if the path is not there for this route, for this book, so it will return the 404 page. But if the fallback is equals to the true, then if it doesn't find any path related to it, it will not result in a 404 page, but it will just check again and again for that route, and it will give you a fallback content like loading or anything with that. So this is the relation between the fallback false and true. So now we have just created the getStaticPaths with the getStaticProps and all of the things with the incremental static generation. So this is all about the getStaticPaths and the getStaticProps and the incremental static generation. So now we are pre-generating all of the books which are available inside the database. But is that a good option? Like if you have millions of products into your database, millions of books, then would you pre-generate all of those million pages inside your application? So I believe no, because that can be a big performance issue, and the load time could be much bigger than this. So because if you are running a website like Amazon, Flipkart, and there you cannot pre-generate all of these pages, and even the incremental static generation won't work, because it will build the app again and again after the app is deployed. So if the data is changing very frequently, then it will just build and generate in a loop. So there can be a big performance issue in the application, and the load time can be much longer. So what can you do? So here is a solution again. So we have the get server side props inside the Next.JS, which is a server side rendering technique. And then what it does, so it is a type of function which runs on every new incoming request. Whenever there will be a new request from the client to the database, it will generate a page from the server and pre-render the page to the client. Very simple. So to pre-render page on every new request, we can use get server side props. And this also works inside the server side and the node environment, and not on the client side. So a new request is made, and then this handles new request, and we also don't even need to use the static paths, because it is very dynamic and it runs on every incoming request. So it gets all of the data with that. So now we will use the get server side props. So now we are into the application again. And here inside the ID, like now we have the ID page, so there can be millions of IDs, so we cannot pre-generate the page for every ID. So now I will now just comment it out, and then now we will use the get server side props instead of this. So I will now remove this, and I will now just use the get server side props. So the structure would be the same, export, async function, and the function would be get server side props. So now this is a function, and now we can use this function from there. And in this function, now we need to just get all of the data as we are getting from there, and we are also getting the params, so we have to get params as well. And after that, we can just have here the const book will be equals to get book from id, and then we can just pass here the params object dot id field inside that. And after that, we will get the book, and then again we can just return this book from there. So we can just have here the return as the object, and inside the objects we will have here the props, and inside the props then we will send the book. So we'll send the book to the book. So if I will now save, and if I will now restart the application again, npm run dev, if I will now just click enter, so now the server is started on the localhost 3000. So if I will now just move on, if I will now refresh the page, and again there is an error because we didn't add the await here. So if I will now just save, and if I will now move on to the application, so now you will see it is running on the server side. And now you can see once we are moving to the book/1, so it is working. And once if I will now just move on to the book/3, so it will also work. Now you can see it is also working. So now it will work on every incoming request, and it will get the params object as well, in which we get the id, and all of the things will now work perfectly fine. And even if we add new page inside that, like if I will now just move on to the localhost 3000/books, I will now remove everything from there, and now you can see now we have the test again as the last book. So if I will now just add another book from there, from the books, click on plus, and then we can add new book. So the last key was 6, I will add the 7. The value would be equals to an object, and inside that object we will add the name, sell like crazy, and after that we can have a description, and in the description we can have some description as well, like sell like crazy book. And after that we can have the id as well. So we can have the id, and the id can be equals to this 6. So if I will now save, and if I will now just click on the add, so now the new book will be then added to the database. And now you can see if I will now just refresh the page, now you can see now we have the sell like crazy book here as well. But how? Because now inside this index.js we are using the getStaticProps and not the getServerSideProps, and the getStaticProps is running after every 10 seconds. So it is now pre-generating the page after every 10 seconds. And then if I will now just click on the go to book, then this page will then move to the server side, and then it will just render the content from the getServerSideProps. So this is how that works. So if I will now just click on the page source as well, and now you can see in the page source, now you can see now we got the new book as well. So we are getting the content inside the HTML as well. So everything is working perfectly fine. And then you can see new book, again new book, and even if we go to the make money, go to book, and if I will now just click on the page source, now you can see now we will get all of the things inside the page source as well. So everything is working perfectly fine, and the make money is also there inside that. So the content is available in the HTML as well. So the SEO is powerful. So everything is working perfectly fine. So now we have made use of the get server side props, get static props, get static paths, and the incremental static generation. So almost the course of the Next.js is now complete. So now we will see that which form to use and when. So we saw that the get server side props gets run after every new request is made to the application. And about the get static props, the get static props is ran at a build time, meaning when we run the npm run build, when we build the application, then static pages are built, and then the get static props are called, and then it pre-generates some pages. And about the server side, in the server side props, we don't know what the outcome will be, and we don't know that what the user wants before they make a request. So we can see which form to use when. So for frequently visited pages, like we can have a contact us page, about us page, home page, we can use the get static props. And then for loading a page only on a request sent by the client, we can use get server side props. And make sure you are using only one technique in a component. Either you can use get static props and use get server side props, but you cannot use both of these forms in only one page or in only one component. So make sure you do that. So now we have completed this module as well. So now we will see the summary. So now we have completed the static site generation inside this application, and then we have also completed the incremental site generation, which we have given the revalidate key to revalidate after every couple of seconds. And then we have also built the static paths generation by giving the getStaticPaths props to that. And after that, we have also created the server-side rendering. So we have completed all of the forms of the pre-rendering data inside the Next.js. So this is all about this module. So thank you for watching the video, and I hope you will like the video as well. So please subscribe to the channel as well so that I can be motivated to post the videos like this. So thank you so much. Hello everyone, my name is Nikhil. So in this video, we will see about the API routing inside the Next.js, in which we will create a full stack application with the Next.js, and what is the API routing and how does it work, and how to create the backend API inside the Next.js. So let's see about the API routing inside that. So in Next.js, the API routing is used to build the APIs inside the Next.js. So we can build the APIs in the Next.js inside the API folder, and that folder will not be accessible to the front end because it runs on the Node environment in the backend terminal, but not inside the client side API, which is the JavaScript. So we can build the APIs with that, and we can also store some credentials like API keys and the password of the databases as well, because that code would not be accessible at front end at all. And then we can also create some REST APIs with that, and we don't need any separate application for creating the APIs as we do inside the React, because in the React we only have a front end application. But in the Next.js, we can have the backend and the front end code in the same application only. So this is the advantage of the Next.js. So now we will see more terms about the API routing, that how does it work. So it works same as the pages routing with dynamic route structure. So it works with the same pages routing, and we can have dynamic IDs, and we can get all of these query functions and queries, parameters, and all of the things inside the API routing as well. And it is very helpful in building the REST API for any project without creating any separate application. So you just need to create the API, and then you can just call the API directly from our application, and that code will not be accessible to the front end. So that's all about the API. So now in this project, we will create a bookstore project. And what is that bookstore project? So first we will build an API of the bookstore, and then we will create a dummy JSON file, and then we will work with the dummy JSON file with the file system. And after that, we will have the file system with that. And after that, when the project will be completed, then we will remove the file system from there. Then we will set up the MongoDB connection, and then we will store everything inside the MongoDB database, and then we will remove the file system JSON from there. So now let's see the demo of that application. So this is the application which we want to build. So now we have some books onto the database, which is directly coming from the database, and then we can also add some book as well from here. So we can just move on to the /add, and then we can just add any book from there as well. Like if I will add a rich dad, poor dad, and then we can add a description like a new book purchased by me, and then we can add an image URL. And here I have the image URL. So if I will now just click on the submit, and the book will be then added to the database. So if we now move on to the application, and then you will see there will be a rich dad, poor dad book as well. So everything in our application is working fine. And I know that this styling is not good because this project is basically focused on the Next.js and not on the styling or CSS. So this is how we can just create some products, and all of the things are now being stored inside the MongoDB database. So everything is dynamic. So now let's start this project. So please like the video and please subscribe to the channel as well, because it will motivate me to post the videos like this. So let's start building that application. And now we are into the VSCode, and now we need to create a new Next.js application directly from the scratch. So the command to create the application would be the npx. It would be the create -next-app, and then the name of the application, like it can be the my app. So now the new Next.js app will be then installed inside the my app directory inside the API routing. So for that, we just need to press enter, and the Next.js app will be then installed within very few moments. And now you can see the Next.js app is now installed inside the my app folder, and then we have the node modules folder which contains some packages. We have the pages folder which contains some routing operations, and then we have the public folder which contains the favicon.io, and then we have the styles folder for the CSS stylings. And then we have other files as well which are needed for the Next.js application. And now the application has been installed, and now we will create a simple API to get something onto the screen. So inside the pages folder, inside the API folder, in this folder we can create some files which are related to the backend and the API generation. And the code inside that folder, inside the API folder, will never be exposed to the front end. So the code inside that runs on the Node.js environment and not onto the client side API, which is the JavaScript. So if we store some credentials here like the database password, some API keys, so that would be safe at all. So now we will create an API. So now we can just move on to the API folder, and then you can see now we have the hello.js, and then you can see we have here the API function which has the export default function, which is the handler. So it is the request handler function, and then it contains a request and the response inside the parameters inside that. So now we will create an API. So if you know about building the API inside the Node or in the Express, then it would be easier for you. But don't worry even if you don't know, and I will explain everything in details, so you will get a good understanding how the API works and how to build the API. So let's start. So now you can see now we have the default API here, which is inside the hello.js. So it will be called whenever we call an API from the fetch function or the Axios from the pages/API/this name like the hello. So now you can say inside this function we have the handler, and then you have the request which we will receive from the front end, and then we have the response which we need to send to the front end. We will receive some request which can contain some data, which can contain so many things, and inside that you also contain that which method is being posted here. Like it can be the get request, it can be the post request, it can be the delete, it can be the put, or any type of request. And after that we have the response parameter in the response which we need to send to the front end. Like here you can see inside this function we are sending a response at the response dot status, it is a 200, which is the OK. And after that we are sending a JSON message with that, with the response, and the JSON message includes a name which has the John Doe. And now you can see now this is the API, and now this function has been exported as well. So now we can just use this function inside the pages inside the index.js as well. So now we need to call this API function here. So for that we can remove everything from there inside this div, and after that we can also remove the class name here as well. So we can remove the class name, and then we don't need any import statements here as well. So now we just have here the export default function which is the home, and now we can just start the application as well before anything. So we can just have here the hello, and then we can just start the application by moving to the /myapp, and then we can just run the command to start the development server, and it will be the npm run dev. So if you don't know about this command as well, so you can just move on to the package.json, and then you can see you have the scripts inside your application which has the dev for the development server, and then you have the build to build the application for the production, and then you have the start to start the build version on your application which has just built, which is the production version, and then you have the lint for the code quality and fixes. And now you can see we can just start the server from the npm run dev. So it will create a local development server onto the port of the 3000, and then we can visit this URL as well. So then you can see you have the control, and then you can click this URL to open it inside the browser. And now you can see the URL is now open, and now we can see the hello onto the web page. And now we need to call this API from this function as well, that is the hello.js. So now we can just call the API here. So we can just create a const, it would be the data, and it will be equals to the fetch. So the fetch function is available throughout the JavaScript and the Node.js, so we can just use the fetch, and in the fetch we have the first parameter of the URL which is required. So we can just have here the URL. So now we are already into the pages directory, so for that we can just move on to the /API/hello to call this hello function here. So for that we can just move on /API/hello. So after that the fetch function would run, and now inside this fetch now we are calling that API, and after that the fetch returns a promise. So we can just handle the then and catch statements here as well. And after the promise, now after calling this request it will receive a response, and for using this response we need to convert the response to the JSON as well to get the JSON data. And after the data has been converted to JSON, then we can just get the then again, and inside this then now we will get the data after converting to the JSON, and then we can just return the data here. So after that everything would work fine, and then we can just log here the data as well. So for that we can just have here the data. So now we can just move on to the inspect, and inside this console window, and now you can see now we have the promise here, and then we are getting the promise inside that, and after that we can get the name as the John Doe inside this promise as well. So now everything is working perfectly fine, and then we are getting the data as well after the promise is resolved, and now everything is working perfectly fine. And now you can just move on to the home function as well, and then you can just declare here a state as well to get this data inside that as well. So for that you can just have here the use state, and in the use state you will get the state variables here. So you can just get here the you can just get here the name and the set name, and inside the use state you will get an empty string, and then you need to import the use state as well from the React. So you just need to import the use state from the React, and after that you can just store the state variables, and then you have the data, and then you can just have here the set data or the set name. It would be the data dot, it would be the name, because we are sending the data object, and in the object we are sending the name. So if I will now just save, and inside that if we now just render the name here only, so we can just have here the name. So we can just remove the console.log as well. So if I will now just save, and now if I will now just move on to the application, we can just refresh the page, and now you can see now we are getting the John Doe inside this application, and the John Doe is now getting from the API, which is the name inside this handle function. So now everything is working perfectly fine, and this is a get type of request because now we are sending a fetch function, and now the method of the request is now get. And if we want to send the method as the post, so we just need to have here an object with more configurations. So we can just have here the method as the post here as well. So you can see we have the method, and after that we can have some headers, and then we can have some bodies and everything inside that. So everything is working perfectly fine, and this is how we can just call the API inside the Next.js as well. So now we have seen that how to get the data from the API, and now it's time to build a project. So now we will create a project with a book store, and then inside that project there will be a dummy data.json file inside our directory. And after that, after the project has been completed, and then we will just work with the real data, with the database, with the MongoDB. So now let's start building that project. So I will now delete this hello.js file from the API because we don't need that. And inside the API, now we will just create a new file, and it will be the books. So now we will have here the books.js file inside that, and now we need to call the API from this API /books and not from the hello, because now the file has been changed and it is deleted, and now we have just created the new file as the books. So now we can just create a function, so it can be the function as the handler, and inside this function first we will get the request from the front end, and then we will send the response to the front end. And after that, inside this function now we will just check if the request dot method which we get is equals to the get, and then only we need to perform a step. So we just have here one more equals to, and now we can just check the method of the request from the request.method as well, because the request object contains so many things, and it also contains the method as well. So inside this method now we will just get here the method, and inside that now we will send some book data inside that. So for that we need to create the book data as well. So now we can just move on to the API routing directory, and inside the my app directory, and inside the my app now we will create a folder as the data, and inside that we can just create a JSON data file for that. So we have the books.json, and inside that we will just have here the empty array inside that, and inside the empty array then we will have a single book onto that. So we can have a single book, and it can be a ID. So the ID can be a 1, and then we can have here the name of the book, and then the name of the book can be a mindset, and after that we can have the description of the book as well, and the description can be equals to the new book, and then we can have the image URL of the book as well with that. So we can have the image URL, and the image URL can be, we can just get the image URL from Amazon or Flipkart. So I will now get the URL, and I will now paste the URL here, and I've got the URL here. So I will now paste this URL here. So now you can see now the book is there. So now we have a single object inside the array data inside the JSON which contains a book. So for that now we can just move on to the books.js file, and inside that we have the request.method get. So if the request.method is equals to the get, now we will send the books data to the front end. So for that now we can just move on, and then we can just import something from the node.js which is available inside that, and it would be equals to the fs, which is the file system, because now we are working with the files directory inside that. So we need to import the fs, which is the file system which is available inside the node.js. So now the fs is now imported from the fs, and after that we can just move on and work with the file system. So now we need to generate the path to get to this file. So for generating the path as well, we need to import something again. We need to import the path from the path to generate the file path, and then we need to move on to this path, and then we need to read this file, and then we need to send the data to the front end. So for that now if the request.method is equals to the get, now we will just generate the path. So it can be the file path, and the file path will equals to the path dot, it would be the join. So we need to join the path. So now the first directory would be the current working directory. So the current working directory is the my app, so we need to add here the process.cwd to get the current working directory. And after that we need to enter the data. So inside the my app we have the data folder, and inside this data we have here the books.json file. So now what it is doing, so it is getting the process.cwd, which is the current working directory, and inside that directory we have the data folder, so we are getting the data, and inside that we are getting the books.json file. So now we are getting the path directly linked to the books.json file, and now we need to read the file as well. So for reading the file, so we can just have here the const the file data, and it would be equals to the file data will be equals to the fs. We have imported the fs module, so the fs.read file, so we will read the file with a synchronous way, so we will read the file sync, and after that we need to add here the path as well, as we are seeing inside the parameter. So here we need to add here the file path that we have just generated. So now we have generated the file path here, so now we are getting the file data, but the file data is in the buffer format. So for that, so now we need to convert the data inside the JSON as well. So for that we can just have the const data, and it would be equals to the file data that we have just used. So we can just pass this data into the JSON as well. So for that we have a JSON.parse, which is available inside the JavaScript, which is available globally inside the JavaScript, and inside this JSON.parse now we will add here the file data that we have just received. So it will just convert the data into the JSON. So now we are getting the data. So now we need to send this data to the front end as well. So if you don't know that you are getting the data or not, so you can just log this data here. So you can just have the log, and after that you need to send the response to the front end as well. So you can just have the response dot status, and the status would be equals to the 200, which is now okay. And after that you can just have here the JSON, and after the JSON, so you can just send here the message, and the message will be equals to the data. So now we are sending a message to the front end, and now we can just return the response as well, because after we are sending the response, so we just don't need to run anything from this handler function. And after that we can just export this function as well. Export default, it would be the handler. So now what we are doing here, so we are checking if the request.method, if there is a get request, and then only we need to perform these steps. So then we are generating the file path from the path.join, and then we are joining the current path from the current working directory inside the data and the books.json. And after that we have the file data, and then we are reading the file from that, and then we are just converting the data to the JSON, and after that we are also logging that data, and then we are sending the response.status is equals to the 200, which is okay, and then we are sending the JSON data inside the message which contains the data. And now everything would work perfectly fine, and now we can just create some components to render the list of the data as well. So for that, again inside the my app directory, so you can just create a new folder as the components, and inside this components you can just create a file, and it can be the book list.js. So then inside the book list, so you can just have here the RAFCE. First you need to import the React from the React, it is optional as well. So now we are getting the book list, and inside that book list now we will call the API here. So for that we can just have the use effect function from the React to call the API, and inside that effect we will just have here the empty array of dependencies inside that, and after that we can just have here the state to store the data as well. So for that you can import the use state as well, so it will contain the data and the set data, and the by default data would be undefined because we don't need anything inside the use state by default. So now we can just import the use state as well. So now inside the use effect, now we can just declare the function before that, and it can be the send request. So it will be the send request, and it will be equals to a function, and after that we can just call the fetch function here. So it will be the fetch, and then it would be available /API/ it would be the books. So now we are sending the request to the fetch/books, and after that this is a promise, so you just need to add the then statements, and after the then you will just get the response from there, and then you need to convert the response to the JSON again, and after that you will get the data. So for that you get the data, and then you can just have the data parameter, and after the data you can just have here the set data, and inside that set data you can just have here the data dot message, that we are sending the message from the backend. So now this is the send request function, and then you can just add here the catch as well, because this is a backend operation and the database can fail as well. So you can just have the catch, and then you can just catch the parameter as the e, and after that you can just log the e as well, that what data that what error we are getting. And after that, inside the use effect, now we will just have here the data as well. So we can just call the send request function only one time because the array is empty. And after that, we can just render the data here. So for that, we can just have here the div, and inside that div we will have here the unordered list, and inside this unordered list we will have here the expressions, and inside that expressions we will just have here the data. So if we have the data, then we can just have here the data dot map because it will be an array, so it would be the data dot map. And inside this map, now we will get the parameters, so we will get the item, and then we will get the index as well as the second parameter. And inside that, now we need to return the list item here, so we can just have the list item for now, and then we can just create a one more component here for the book item, which will just create every single list item inside that. So we can have a book item .js, and inside that book item, now we will have here the data. So we can just have here the refce again, and then we can just remove the react here as well. And after that, it will contain the li, and inside that li, it will contain the image first. So the image, the source will contain from the props, so we will receive the props here as well. So in the props, we will just have here the we can have here the name, we can have here the description, and then we can have the ID of the book, and then we can also have the image URL of the book as well. So we can have the image URL, and after that, inside the source, then we can just have here the image URL here, and after the image URL, we will have the alt, and then in the alt we can have the name of the image. And after that, we can just have here the s3 tag, which will contain the name of the book, so it will contain the name. And after the name, we can just have here the paragraph tag for the description, so we can just have here the description. And after the description, so everything would work fine. So if I will now save, so now if I will now just move on to the book list again, and now inside this book list, now we need to render the book item here after the mapping. So we will just create a book item inside that, so the book item will be then imported. And after that, we can just send some props. We can just send here the description, it would be the item dot description, and after that we can just send here the name, so it can be the item dot name, and after the name it can be the, we can just send here the ID, so it would be the item dot ID. And after that, we can just have here the image URL, so it would be the item dot image URL. And after that, we can just send here the key as well, because the React needs a keys to render the list, so we can just have here the key as the index that we are getting here. So now we are getting the index here, so we are sending the index, so everything would work fine. So now we are rendering the data as well inside that, so we are having the book list, and inside that we have the send request function, and then we are updating the data as well from there, and then we are checking if we have the data, and then only we need to have here the data.map, and then we will render the list inside that. And then we are using the use effect as well, and then we have the empty array of dependencies, and it would run only one time after the component is rendered. So now we need to run this component inside the index.js as well, so we can just move on to the index.js, and then we can remove everything from there because we don't need them at all. And now we can just remove the use state as well. And now inside this div, instead of this div, now we will have here the book list inside that. So we'll have the book list, and then we need to render the book list here. So if we now save, and if we now move on to the application, now you can see, now inside this handler function inside the books.js, now we got the data, and now we are getting the data inside the console.log as well. So now we can just move on to the application. Now you can see, now we are getting the data inside that, and now we are getting the data, we can get the image, and then we are getting the name of the book, and then we are getting the new book as well. And now as you can see, now we are getting the data inside browser as well. Everything is working perfectly fine, but now you can see the styling of the data is not good, so we need to style the data as well. So for that, we can just move on to the styles, and then we can just create a new CSS file, and it will be the books.module.css file to define some styles. And then we can just have here the first style, it would be the list container, which will be available inside the UL, and inside that we can just have here the display, and it can be the flexbox, so we'll use a flexbox logic, and it would be the flex direction, it would be the row, so the by default is also row, so we don't need to specify that. And after that, we can just have the align items, it would be the flex start, and after that we can have a justify content as well, so it would again be the flex start. So after that, we can just have the list style type, so it would be the none because we don't need that round icon inside the list as well. And after that, we can just have here the flex, and the flex would be equals to the 1, So we need to get the full screen size, and after that we can just have here the align content, and it would be the flex start again. So this style would be then applied to the UL, which is the list container. And after that we need to apply some styles to the list item as well. So we can just generate the list item as well. It would be the list item. So the list item would have the margin. It would be around some 10 pixels. And after that we can just have the border. And the border can be equals to the 1 pixels. It would be the solid. It would be the /ccc. And after that we can just have here the width. So we need to specify the width for every list item. So for the width can be equals to the 200 pixels. And after that we can just have the padding of the 8 pixels as well. So now we have just defined some styles, and now we need to import the styles inside the book list as well. So we need to import the classes from the CSS inside the modules. So after we have converted the CSS to the books.module.css, so we can just import the classes from the CSS here, like we are importing the classes. And we need to import the classes from the CSS file, like we can just move on to the directory. We can just move on to the styles, and then we can just move on to the books.module.css. So now we are getting the classes, and inside that UL now we can just give the class. It would be the class name would be equals to the classes dot, and it would be the name of this class that we are just giving here. So we are just giving the class name and the list container. So it would be the list container inside that. So it will be the list container. And now if we now save, so now you will see there will be the list container style would be applied to the list container, and now you can see thus round type is also gone. And now we can just move on to the book item as well to give the style to the li as well. So we can just import. It would be the import classes from, and it would be equals to the /styles folder, and inside the styles folder now we'll have the book.module.css, and inside that CSS now we can just give the class name to the li as well. So we have the class name, and it would be equals to the classes dot the name of the class name, like inside the classes. Now we can just move on to the book module. So we have the classes of the list item, so we can just give the class name as the list item. So now we can just save, and if we now move on to the browser, and now you can see the image style is not good, so we can just style the image as well. So inside this again, inside this books.module.css, now we can just get the list item, and then we can just target the image element from the list item, and then we can just have the width and be equals to the 100% of the parent, and the height can be equal to the 40% of the parent. So if we now save, so now you can see the styling is now perfectly good, and now you can see now we have the image, and now we can give more styles as well to the box. So we can just have the height as well. So the height can be equals to the 300 pixels, and so after giving the height, so everything is working perfectly fine. So now we are getting all of the books by calling the API. So now the API for get request is working perfectly fine. Now we have seen the get requests, and now it's time to perform a post HTTP request. So with that we can create a new page, and inside that page we can create a form component, and then we can just send the data of the form, like the data which will contain a new book, and then we can send that data to the backend server, which is the API server that we have created, to store it inside a database or inside of a file that we have just created as the JSON file. So for the post request we need to modify the handler function as well. So as we are just getting here the request.method is equals to the get. So if the get request is there, so we are performing this code, and now we can just have here the else if block as well. We can have the else if. So if the request.method would be equals to the post, and then we need to perform some steps. So the first thing which we want is we will get some data from the front end. So as we are sending the data from the front end to backend, so we will get some things from the request.body. So we will get, and we will just destructure the things from the request.body. So we will get the name of the book, so it will contain the name. Then we will get the description of the book, so we'll get the description as well. And then we will get the image URL of the book as well. So we get these three things from the request.body object from the front end. So we can just save, and after that what we need to do is we need to get the data of the file again, and then we need to insert that record there. So what we can do is we can just copy that code and we can just paste it, or that would be a code duplication. So we can just create a new function here before the handler. So it can be the function, it would be the get data, and inside that get data we can just get all of these three lines, and then we can just have this, and then we can just store these things inside the get data, and then we can return the data. So now we have the data, and now inside this get request also, so we can just have the const data equals to the get data. So we will get the get data from the function above. So now we can just save, and now inside this post request, now what we can do is first we can just get the data again. So we can just get the const data. It would be the get data. So now we need to store the newly created book into this data. So how we can do that? So first we can just create a new book. So for that we can just have a const new book, and it would be equals to, an object. So the object will contain the name field, the description, the image URL, and after that, so the image URL, and after that we can just have here the ID of that book. So for the ID we can just give any ID to the books, like here we can just have here the ID would be equals to the date dot now. So it will give a number, so we can just have here the ID as the date dot now. So now we are just creating a new book inside the post request. So for that, now we already got the data, so the data should be here. So after that, now we will just push the data. So we have the data dot push, because it is an array of the objects, so we can just have here the data dot push, and then we will just push to the data, and it will be the new book. So it would be the new book. So this is how can we do the things. So, and after sending the data to the file, then we can just return here the response as well. Return response dot status would be equals to the 201, which is created, and after then we can have a JSON message. We can have a message, and it can be added, and then we can just have here the new book as well. So we can just have a newly created book. Book will be equals to the new book that we have just created. So now we are sending two messages inside the JSON. So we have the message as the edit, and then we are sending a new book, which is just newly created book with that. So if we now save, if we now just move on to the application, now what we can do to perform this API call is we can just move on it, and we can just create a new page inside the pages folder, and it can be an add. So now we will move on to the localhost 3000/add, and then there will be a form. So for the add, there will be a function to the add book, or it can be just a add. After that, we will return a new component which we will call. So now we will create a new component as well. So inside the components folder, we will create a add book component .js, and after that there will be rafc command to create a component setup, and inside that we can just have the form. So inside that there will be a div, and after that div we will have here the form. So inside this form also we will have some labels and the input. So we'll have the label HTML4 equals to the name of the book, and after that we can have the input. We can just have here the input after the label, and after that we can just copy that two more times. So it would be the description, and for the image URL, so we have the label HTML4 equals to the name, so it will be the description, and then it would be the image URL. And now inside the inputs as well, we need to define here some properties, like we need to define the name of the input, because we need to get the data, because the name is the identifier from where we can get the data. So the name is equals to the name, and inside that the name would be equals to description, and after that inside that we have the name equals to the image URL. So now we have just defined the inputs with their labels as well, and now we need to get the data of this form as well. So we can just have here the button to submit the form. It will be the type equals to the submit, and then it will be the submit, and after that now this is the form. So if we now save, and if I will now just move on to the add.js, and then we can just return this add book component here. So we have the add book, and then we can just return this function as well. So it will be the export default, and it would be the add. So if we now save, so now you will see, once I will just move on to the localhost 3000/add, so then you will see there will be a form to add the data, and now you can see the form is not looking good. So we need to just style the form as well. So we can just move on to the add book. I will close other files, and now you can see we have the label. So we can have the label equals to the name for the name, and then we can have a label of the description, and then we can just have here the label for the image URL as well. So for the image URL, and then we can just generate a CSS style as well. For that we can just move on to the styles, and then we can just have here the form dot module dot CSS for defining some CSS styles. And what would be the styles? So first there will be the container of the form, which is the div, and inside the div we can just have here the width of the 50% of the available screen, the height of the 50%, and it will contain the margin as the auto to align it to the center, and then we can just have the margin from the top to define, like it will be the 20 pixels. So now we have defined the container, and now we will define the form control. And inside this form control, we have a display into the flex, and then the flex direction would be into the column. So now these two properties would be there inside the form control because we want to display it to the flex box, and then the flex direction would be into the column. So we can just see things column wise on the top of every item. And now we can just have here some more styles. We can have a justify from the content to the center of the web page, and now everything would work fine. So if we now just move on to the ad book, and now we need to import the CSS style from there as well. So import the classes as we have done inside this book item as well. Classes from the form, it would be the slash styles slash, we need to get here the form dot module dot css file. So now we are importing the classes as well from there inside the form dot module dot css. And now we can just give the styles here. So we can have a class name equals to the classes dot container, as we have defined the container, and here in the form we can have there the class name would be equals to the classes dot, and it would be equals to the form control. So now we have just defined the classes here. So if we now save, if we now move on to the application, you can refresh the page, and now you can see now we have this form, and now the form is just looking fine and not the good because this is not a CSS course, this is a Next.js course. And now we need to get the data of the form as well. So how can we get the data? So we can just use the form handling with the use state. So we can just have here the use state snippet. So we will have the inputs object and the set inputs function to update the inputs, and then we will just import the use state, and inside that we will have the name field. The fields here inside the use state should be same as but defined inside the input names. So make sure that they both are same. So we have the name equals to the empty string by default, and then we will have the description, and the description will also be an empty string, and then we will have here the image URL, and the image URL will also be an empty string by default. After that we need to define the values for them as well. So like here we have the input equals to the name. So for the input name we can have a value would be equals to the inputs dot name, and then we need to define a onChange function. So whenever the value will be changed, whenever there will be the target change of the input, so we will just grab that new value as well. So we can just create a new function const as the handle change, and the function will be equals to an event. It will get an event by default, and then we can just call this function on every input. So then we can have on change will be equals to the function of the handle change. So then we need to save, and now we need to give value and the on change to all of the other inputs as well. So we need to give to this as well, and the value will be equals to the input or description for this. And after that we need to give the value and the on change to the image URL as well, and then the value would be the inputs dot image URL and not the description. So we have defined the inputs, and we have defined the value equals to the input dot name for the name field, inputs dot description for the description field, and the image URL for the image URL field. So now we need to get the data of this form. So how can we get the data? So first we will just call the set inputs function to update the inputs after that. So we can have a data by just targeting the name field. We will target the name identifier for every input, and then we will just update the value from that name property as well. Like how can we do that? So we can just target the e.target.name property for the name, and then we can just update the value from the e.target.value of that specific name only. So for that, inside the set inputs, first we will grab the previous state because we don't need to do previous state after every input is being entered. So for that we can have a previous state, and the previous state, after that we can just store the state here. So now after the previous state, now we need to first store the previous state. So we have the previous state inside that, and after that we need to just target the property. So the property would be there inside the square brackets. So we will just target the e dot target dot, it would be the name. So we'll target the name property of every text field. Like if there would be the name, so it will target this input. So if there would be the target dot name equal to description, so it will target this input. And if there would be the target equals to the image URL, it will target this input. So after we are targeting that, we can just get the value as well, e dot target dot value. So this is how the things work inside that. So now we are grabbing the previous state. So the previous state should also be stored inside that, and then we are targeting the property name and then the value of that property of the input. So if we now save, so now you can see, once I will just move on to the name fields, and now you can see we can just type anything inside that and the description as well. and inside the image field as well. And now we need to get the data of what we have entered. So for that, we can just have here the onSubmit function to the form, and the onSubmit function would be then called whenever we will click the submit button. So we'll have the new function as the handle submit inside that. So the handle submit would be there. And now we can just have, and then we can just declare the handle submit here as well. onStatic handle submit would be equals to a function which will get an event. And after that, the first thing which it can do is it can just prevent the default behavior of the HTML page, because it sends the data to the URL and it refreshes the page. So we need to stop that. So we can just have here the prevent default. So with the prevent default, it will not refresh the page and it will not send any data to the URL or anything. And after that, once we are submitting the form, so for now we can just log all of the inputs data from logging the input state from there. So if we now save, if we now move on to the application, once I will move on to the inspect, if we now move on to the console, I will remove everything. So once I will click on the submit, and now you can see all of the things are now working fine. And now we are getting the values of all of the fields. We are getting the name, and then we are getting the description, we are getting the image URL as well. So everything is working perfectly fine. So now what we have completed is we have completed getting the form data. And now what after that is we can just call the API, as we have defined the API just now inside the books.js. We have defined the post request here in the else if block, and then we are getting the name, description and the image URL from the request.body. So we need to send these three things, and then it will generate a new book, and then it will generate ID of the new book as well dynamically from the date, and then it will just push the new data to the new book. So now we can just call the API here. So after the handle submit is called, so we can just have here the const, it would be the send request, and it will be equals to a function, and inside that function we will just call here the fetch function. So we'll call the fetch, and now this will be a post request. And how the post request performs inside the fetch, so we need to add /API/books to target the API/books inside that. After that, we need to add here the second parameter here, and inside that book item there was only a get request, so we didn't specify any second parameter, but here we need to define. So we have the method first inside the object, because we have defined the options object. So we have the object here, and in that we have the method. The method would be equals to the post here, and after that we need to define here the body, as we are just defining the request.body inside the books.js here body, request.body. So we need to send here the body as well of the data. So the body would contain a stringified version of the data. So we can just call here the JSON.stringify. So we will just stringify all of the data that we have. So it will contain the name. The name will be equals to the inputs dot name. After that, it would be the description. So do the inputs dot description, and after that there will be the image URL. It will be the image URL, and it will be the inputs dot image URL. So now we have just defined the body, and now what after that? Now we need to define one more thing inside the fetch function. It would be the headers of the request. Now we need to send the request header so that it can specify that what data we are giving from the front end. So it doesn't know that what data we are giving, so we need to specify here the headers. So the headers will contain that what type of data that we are sending. So here we have the headers object, and inside that object there will be another object which will contain the content. So it will be the content, it will be the type. So we need to send the content type would be equals to the application -JSON. So this is what we need to send inside the headers. So we need to send that the content type that we are sending is the application/JSON. So this is what we are sending, and after that the fetch returns a promise. So we can just call it the then statement as well, and the first parameter that it contains is the response. So what are the response what you are getting? So we can just convert the response to the JSON as well. So now we have the JSON converted response, and after that we get the data as well. So what data that we get? So we can just have here another then statement, and then we can just console.log that data as well. So here we will get the data after the response is converted to the JSON. So we will just console.log the data as of now. So we'll have the data inside that. So now we need to call the send request function as well. So we can just have here the validation as well inside that. So if the inputs dot name is empty, or if we don't have the inputs dot description, and if we don't have the inputs dot image URL, then we need to just return, or else we can just have here the send request function that we need to call. So now we are sending the send request. So now here we have the validation. If we don't have the inputs.name or the inputs.description, so if these are the empty strings, so we need to just return. Now we don't need to perform the request, and inside this else block we need to send the request to the database inside the send request. So if we now save, if we now move on to the application, if I will now just add a new book, it can be the Atomic Habits, and after that we can have a description as the new book purchased by me, and after that we can have the image URL. So I will get an image URL of that book from the Amazon or the Google. So now I've got the image URL for that. So if we now just paste the image URL, and if I will now just click on the submit, and now you can see what data did we get. So we get the log of the inputs, but we got one more data which is coming from the server side. And what is that data? So the data that we are sending from the request handler function, so we are sending a new book which has the status equals to the 200, because now the new book is now added to the database. And then you can see now we have the message as the edit, and then we have the book as well. For the description we have generated the new ID, we have given the image URL and the Atomic Habits. So now the book is added to the database. So if we now just move on to the localhost /3000, and if we now refresh the page, so now if we now go to the home page, now we cannot see the newly created book. But why? If we now move on to the books handler function, so we have the handler function, and then we are just getting the data, and then we are pushing the data to the new book. But I think we have missed one thing. So we are not writing to the file, we need to write the data to the file as well. So for that we have the fs.write file, and it will be in the synchronous way. So in the write file, now we need to add the path as well. So we can just get the path again by getting the path from the file path here. So we can just get the file path here in the file path, and after the file path, now we can just add the file path inside this file path sync, because it needs a parameter of the file. We need to add the path, and after that we need to add the data inside the string. So we need to add the JSON dot stringify, because it will stringify the data, and then it will be the data. So now we are just getting the file as well, and then we are just getting the data, and then we are pushing a new book to the data, and then we are writing the file in the synchronous way, and then we are giving the file the data. If we now save, if we now move on to the localhost 3000 / it would be the add. So once I will click on the name, like it can be Atomic Habits, it can be the description of the, I think the description can be there's a new book by me, and then we can have the image URL of this. If we now move on to the inspect and the console to see if everything is working fine, we now click on the submit, and now you can see again the message is added and the response is successful. Once I will just move on to the books.json file now, and now you can see now we have the array of the books. Once I will format, and now you can see now we have Atomic Habits book inside this file as well. So everything is working perfectly fine, and we are just able to insert the data inside the JSON file as well. So if we now move on to the home page, and now you can see that the book is now available here as well. So everything is working perfectly fine, and now we are getting all of the books, and now we are able to just send a new book to the database as well. So for now we don't have any database, so we have just a books.json file. So everything is working perfectly fine, and now our application and the API is working perfectly fine, and the last step which is remaining is working with the real database and not with the JSON file. Although it's working fine, but having a real database in our application is always the best approach. So we will connect our application to the MongoDB database, which is a NoSQL database, and we will connect to it with a cloud version of the MongoDB. So we don't need to install anything in our system. So we will just connect to the MongoDB with a cloud link, and then we will store and get the data from there. So let's start. So for that we can just move on to the mongodb.com, and after that there will be option to the sign in. So you can just click on the sign in, and after that there will be option to log into your account. So you can just select Google or GitHub. So I will select the Google. So you can just log in from the Google, and after that you will be seeing there will be a screen, and after that you can just click on the drop down, and you can just select a new project from there. So now you can select new project, and you can give a name, and it can be a Next Bookstore. So you can just click on the next, and after that there will be a members. So you can just skip that, and you can just click on the create project button. So it will just create a brand new MongoDB project for our application. And now you will see our application is being created. So for that, now we need to just click on the build a database button from there. Now you can see now we have a button of the build a database. So we can just click on that, and then you will see now we have three options. If you want to go with the serverless, so you can just move on to the serverless, and it's a paid version. And then if you want to move on with the dedicated version, which is an advanced version that you can use, so you can just click on that. but we will now use it with a free version. So I will now click on the free version and I will now click on the create. So it will just create a shared cluster for us to work with the MongoDB, and after that you can just keep the default settings, and then we can just click on the create cluster. So it will just create a new cluster for our application which is working on the cloud. And now you can see, now you will have a security quick start. So you can just provide the username and the password. So I will now give the username as the admin, and I will now just click on the auto generate secure password, and I will just copy that password as well inside there. So I will now keep this password here, and then we can just click on the create user. So it will just create a new user for a database to use this database, and after that you can just move on to the network access from there. So here you have the option to add the IP address. So you can just click on the add IP address button, and then if you want to allow from your current IP address, so you can just add the current IP address, but I will now allow the access from anywhere, and I will now just confirm. So now we have confirmed everything from there, and now we can just move on to the database from there, and now we have to wait till it deploys our MongoDB. And after that, to connect with the MongoDB, so we need to install a new package which is the MongoDB. So for that we need to stop the terminal, and then we need to install a new package which is the MongoDB. So then it will install a MongoDB driver into our application, and then we will just connect, and then we will just play around with the MongoDB with this package. So then we have to wait till it installs. So now the MongoDB is now installed, and now we can just restart the application again from the npm run dev. And after that, now here in the books file, now we were working with the file system. So now we need to remove everything from there, from the file, and now we can also remove the get data function from there. And after we are sending this in the get request, so we were having the get data, so we need to remove that also. And now inside this name, description, and the required body, and inside this post request, now we were sending the data to the file, and now we need to remove that also. And now we were generating the ID statically from our hand, so now we need to remove that also. So now we have this API now, and now it is a blank API, and now we need to work with the MongoDB. So the first thing that we can do is we can import the MongoDB from the MongoDB. So now the MongoDB is now imported, and now what we can do is we can just have here in the handler function. So first what we can do is we can just import the Mongo client from the MongoDB, and after that we have the function to the connect. So we have the Mongo client function which has the client connect function with the client, so we can just use that function. And after that we need to add the URL to connect to the MongoDB. So we can just get the URL from the connect button from there. So we have the connect button, and after that you have the connect to application button, and after that you have this URL here which can connect to a database. So we can just copy that URL, and then we can just paste this URL here. And after that, now we have the password. So we need to remove this statically typed password here, and then we need to add the password that we have just copied. So we can just copy that, and then we can just paste the password here. And after that, this will just connect to the MongoDB database, and it is an asynchronous task, and it also returns a promise. So we can use the await as well. So for that we can just add here the async function for the handler, because these are the request functions and these can be async as well. So we can just have here the const client will be equals to the await. It will be the Mongo client dot connect. So it will just await for this connection, and after that it will just perform the steps. So now after the connection, now we need to create here the database. So what data that we can create? So we can have here the create database, and after the database, so we have here the const. So we need to generate a database variable const db equals to the client that we have just accessed dot db. So we have a function of the db, so we need to add here the db of the client. So we can have a db of the books. So after creating the database, now what we can do is we can just target a collection, and then we can just get all of the records of that collection. And how can we do that? So we can just create a variable inside this get request, and it would be the books. So the books will be equals to the db that we have just created dot collection. So we need to target the collection of the db, and the collection will also be the books. And after that we need to add here the method dot find. So we have a find method in the MongoDB which runs on a query. So if we specify a query here, so it will just return that records which matches the query. But if we don't add anything here, so it will just return all of the documents. And after that we can just sort that document as well, sort. And after that we can just generate the document to the array as well. So now we have the books array, and then this is also async operation, so we can just add the await for that. So now we have all of the books inside that. And after that we have the message, so we can just have here the message equals to the books. So this is how it works. And after that we can add a validation as well, like if we don't have the books, like if the database operation is failed, then we can just return the response dot status will be equals to the, it will be the 400 or it can be the 500 as the internal server error. And after that we can have a JSON message, and the message can be internal server error. And now if we have the books, then we will return the response.status equals to the 200, and then we will send the message as the books. So that should work. And now in the post request, now we can have here the await again. So it can be the db.collection, and the collection would also be the books again dot, and it would be the insert one. So we have the method of the insert one which we can use. So it will just insert a one record into the database, so we can have a new book that we have just created. So we can just store that in a variable as well. So we can just have here the const, it will be the new book, or it can be a response will be equals to this new book. So after that, now we are generating the new book, and now we can see we have the response variable. And now if you will just check the response, now you will see now we have the acknowledged and the inserted ID. So what are that? So the acknowledged is if the record is now inserted, so the acknowledged property will be true, and if the record is inserted as well, so we can get the inserted ID of that as well. So we can just save, and now we can see now we are just generating a new book as well. If we now save, and if we now move on to the application localhost 3000, and now you will see there will be nothing on to the web page as of now. Even if we move on to the inspect in the console, there will be nothing on the web page. But once I will move on to the request / add, there will be the add book, and now we can just add a new book like the atomic habits. There will be a description like this is a new book from me, and there can be the image URL like this. So once I will click on the submit, and I think there is an error. So I think the error is because now we are giving the response, so it should not be the response, or it can be the generated book. So if I will now just save, if I will now just move on to the application, once I will just click on the submit again, and now you will see now we have the message equals to the edit, and now we are just also getting the new book as well. So once I will just move on to the MongoDB again, and if I will now just move on to the browse collections to see if the book is inserted or not. So we can just move on to the collections, and then you can see now we have the database, and then we have the collection, and now you can see the books are now inserted into the database as well. So we can just delete that book from here because it was added accidentally. So now this book is now deleted, so everything is working perfectly fine. So if we now just move on to the localhost 3000, now you can see now we are getting two books here onto our web page, and now you can see everything is working perfectly fine. And now if we now move on, and if we now move on to /add, and if we now move on there, and now we can just add here the book as the mindset. We can have a description as again this is a new book by me. We can have the image URL as well, so I will get the image URL from the Amazon, and now I've got the image URL, so I will now paste this image URL here. So once I will just click on the submit, so now you can see the new book will be then added. So once I will just move on to the /3000, and now you will see there will be 3 books onto the database. So everything is working perfectly fine, and now we are able to get all of the books from the database, and now we are able to post the books to the database as well. So everything is working perfectly fine, and the final thing which is remaining is adding some validations to our logic. So what does that mean? So now here we can see if we have the request.method equals to the get. So we need to now format the code a little bit, and now we can just remove the create database from there. And after that, now we can see now we have the request.method equals to the get. So now this is a database operation, and it can fail as well. So we can just have here inside the try catch block. So we can just have here the try, and then we can just have here the catch here, and it will contain an error. So we will just log the error. So now we can just have here the const books inside that. So we can just remove that from here, and I will now remove that here. So we can just remove that here, and I will now paste here, and I will now create a books variable here outside of that. So let books will be equals to this, and now we can just remove this const from there. So now you can see let books, and now you can see books equals to the await this, and then if we get an error, so we'll just return the error as the console.log e. And now we can see now if we don't have any books, and now we are just returning the status as the 500 as the JSON message internal server error. And after that, once we got the books, and then we are sending the message as the books. So everything is working perfectly fine. And then we can see inside the post request, now we can add some validations for the inputs as well. So we can just have here the if we don't have the name, or if the name dot trim, so it will remove this white space, will be equals to the empty string. And after that, we will check the same for the description as well. So if we don't have the description, and if the description dot trim will be equals to again an empty string, And again we will check that for the image URL as well. So for the image URL, if we don't have the image URL, and if the image URL dot trim would be equals to an empty string, and then we need to just return the response dot status to the 500, or it can be a 422 of the invalid inputs. So the 422 describes the invalid input data which comes from the front end, and after that we can just add a JSON message equals to the message, and it can be invalid data. And now we are just generating a new book after that only, and then we can just have here the const generated book before that. So we can just add here the try catch block again. We can add a try catch, and inside the try catch now we need to run this code. So now we can just have here the generated book here. So now I will now remove this const, and I will now just create a variable as the const as the generated book. So then you will see now we have the generated book, and then we will just run this inside the try catch block because it is a database operation and it can fail as well. So after that we can just have here the return. It will be the console.log the error that we are receiving, and after that we are now sending the status equals to the 201 which is added. So if we now save, if we now move on to the localhost 3000/add, if we now add the book here, like so, if we now send the empty data here, click on the submit, now you can see the response will not be made, and now everything is working perfectly fine, and also the validation is also working inside the front end as well. So if we move on to the add books, and now you can see we have also added some validations here previously as well. But if I will now just remove everything from there, if I will now just have this send request function, so if I will now save, refresh the page, and then if I will now just click on the submit, and now you can see now we got the message as the invalid data, because now we can see the error is the 422 which is unprocessable entity, and the invalid data is being posted here. So we have the validations on the both and the front end and the back end as well. So everything in our application is perfectly fine, and now we have just completed the application. We have just created some books onto the first the JSON file, and then we were having the file system, and then we connected to the real database, and then we inserted and we got all of the books which we then stored inside the database. So everything in our application is completely fine and everything is working, and this is the final summary of our application. So we have the books onto the front end, and then we can just add the books to the database as well. So everything is working perfectly fine inside the API routing. So this is the application that we have built. So we have built the API routes inside our application. We have created the REST API for getting and for sending the data to the database, and then we are storing the data inside the MongoDB as well. And then we have created a full stack application with the Next.js, and this was a very basic application, but I hope you have learned a lot from this module. So thank you for watching this video, and I hope you will like the video as well. So please like the video and please subscribe to the channel as well, so I should be motivated to post the videos like this. So that's all for this video. So thank you.